Late last week, the Colson Center hosted a special live conversation and Q&A with Pastor Chris Brooks of Moody Radio and apologist writer Andy Crouch about how we as Christians can respond to the killing of George Floyd and the protests and violence that have swept the nation since. Both Chris and Andy have been participants in our Truth, Love, Together event, which is now in week 4. Please come to colsoncenter.org to view all of our speakers and modules. Now let's get to our conversation with Chris Brooks and Andy Crouch, as introduced by John Stonestreet.
I don't know if you guys even need an introduction. Andy is a tremendous thought leader, works with Praxis. Andy has given us 2 or 3 articles just in the last 2 or 3 months that have been shaping for so many organizations, including the Colson Center. Chris Brooks is a pastor in Detroit at Woodside Bible Church and also leads Equipped with Chris Brooks every day on Moody Radio, which is a wonderful call-in radio program. So, gentlemen, thanks so much for being a part of this conversation tonight. Chris, I want to start with you. Give us the foundational starting point to even understand what we've seen over the last week. I know that's a hard question. Can you do that in 30 words or less? Could you at least give us kind of the foundational categories that we need to start with as Christians?
Yeah, I think I would frame it this way, John, that if we who are believers in God's sacred word believe that each individual is an image bearer of God and carries with them intrinsic value, if we would call ourselves, as many of us do, pro-life Christians, then to see the excruciating video of a man dying, as at this point we know 3 police officers put the weight of their bodies on him as he gasped for air, as he cried out for mercy, as he begged for his life, to have those pleas ignored, to have community residents crying out for his life, to have those pleas ignored. It should not only be heartbreaking, but it should be absolutely devastating. 9 minutes, just shy of that, George Floyd laid on the ground in excruciating pain as he cried out, "I cannot breathe." I think that what complicates this matter more, John, is not just that it was a death that was unjust, but it was at the hands of authorities, those who are called to protect and serve. Police officers, law enforcement agents, who, let me just say up front, the vast majority of them do a phenomenal job at a very difficult task. And I reject the narrative that somehow this is people against police. No, this is those who are committed to justice crying out against injustice. That's the narrative on all sides. But police officers are unique, law enforcement agents, in 2 ways, John. Number one, they're the only group that's allowed to take away a person's freedom without judicial intervention. That's what we call an arrest. They're allowed to rob someone of their freedom without judicial intervention. And in limited situations, they're the only groups that we permit to take someone's life without judicial intervention. With that much power must come accountability. And what we have seen far too frequently has been the abuse of that power by some, which should break our hearts, those of us who love law enforcement, who have law enforcement in our families, that the unjust acts of some has caused distrust between the community and that profession. But we also have to connect it to a broader narrative, John, and that is that those who are African Americans have suffered under sanctioned, governmental, authorized abuse of power for many, many decades, many decades. I could go back to Bull Connor, civil rights movement. We know about the horrors of the South, where police departments were allowed to, without any sense of voice or reprisal, abuse their power when it came to blacks. And so now what we've seen is lament and rage that has been suppressed for decades and longer for some erupt across our nation in civil unrest. Some in peaceful protests, others who have resorted to expressing their rage through violence, and others who have hijacked the movement for nefarious reasons. But yet this is what I believe, John, we're seeing in this moment.
Andy, your talk had so much to do with, in fact, Anne says specifically, thanks for your insights on fermentation versus carbonation. And of course, your whole talk was about the Christian virtue of patience. And you and I kind of emailed about this a little bit, but that's really the first question. You talked about patience as being a culture-changing sort of thing. How do you connect the call to patience with this cultural moment in which patience seems like the last thing on anyone's mind? Either, we've got to have justice now, or we've got to stop these violent riots right now. Patience just doesn't seem to be in the vocabulary.
I've been haunted by that question, I would say, because I recorded that talk before before the killing of George Floyd, though the killing of Ahmaud Arbery was in the news already, and the killing of Breonna Taylor. Each of these has its own conditions, but each of these is senseless and should provoke outrage. And listen, as a white man for whom the whole system has been set up for hundreds of years to benefit and protect and insulate from suffering, it's a very dangerous thing to say anything about patience in the face of injustice in particular. That being said, if we think about the very root idea of patience as the ability to bear with suffering, let's add in a redemptive way, in a way that does not simply compound suffering or compound violence. The troubling reality is that the Roman Empire was absolutely stuffed with violence, and the first Christians were sort of trained themselves to bear it rather than return it. Now, they trained those who had power to not use violence. It was routine in the Roman world. If you were a male, if you were a property owner, 20% of the empire was slave, not in the race-based slavery that we have had in the U.S. and Western context, but nonetheless, treated as property. You would routinely use violence to get people to do what you wanted them to do. And then, of course, there was every temptation, if you had the opportunity, if you were one of the subjugated people, to retaliate when you could. And the first Christians, and we have this in Scripture, including in the context of slavery in Peter's letter, and it's tricky to read it in the modern context, but they counsel a different way that is not accepting of injustice, but is able to bear it and offer a redemptive response. And I suppose the other area where patience becomes important is building. To build good things takes time, and to rebuild when things have been broken especially takes time. And if there's one recurring sin, I think, of the white community, when these incidents rise to our attention, because we have a threshold below which we don't know what's going on, even though our black brothers and sisters know every day what's going on and experience it every day. When it rises to our attention, there are these moments where we get very activated and very contrite and feel a real sense of remorse, you could say. But we are not patient enough to ask, what would it take to actually reform and restore these systems? Because we're dealing with now 400 years of racialized violence in the Americas. And the idea that you could solve that quickly, it's not going to happen. It hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen after this event, as cataclysmic as it feels right now. And so in this sense, we really desperately need to cultivate patience, because the work of bearing with the suffering of what we've inherited and the suffering of what it will take to repair it is going to take, it's a generations long work. And in those senses, we need patience. Now, I don't at all think we need to be somehow in any way patient with the kind of brutality that we've witnessed recently. It's not wrong to be angry and to want change now, but the change to actually be implemented and make a difference in the long run will actually require patience on everyone's part.
Chris, I want to spin off that, and I've got another question from one of our viewers here, but I want to ask this carefully, but it just came to mind. In Andy's analysis that it takes a long time to build, and especially to rebuild, do you see what we're seeing right now as part of that building process? Like, are we in the process? And, there's obviously moments where it becomes, in one sense, what happened to George Floyd would have been glossed over, swept aside, not taken seriously at all. Everyone agreed, until so many retreated to political corners. But pretty much the whole nation was outraged. And it wasn't even like past events where, people were trying to explain it away. Are we on the journey here? Do you see it as that, or is it hard for you to see it as that?
Yeah, I think I want to balance what Andy just said with Dr. King's words from his letter from a Birmingham jail where he talked about the fierce urgency of now.
Yes.
And I think what's burning in the souls of Black people throughout this country, as Andy properly referenced, the centuries of injustice at the hands of those who have been sworn to uphold the Constitution or protect and serve or whatever term you want to use. There is a fierce urgency of now. And honestly, you know, there is a sense of progress that should not be denied. I talked today to several law enforcement agents, one who came on the force as an African-American, 1968, Louisville, Kentucky. And he will tell you the difference in conditions now as opposed to when he came on board. And yes, praise God that the law enforcement field, by and large, has had a unified outcry that something desperately wrong happened here. But yet within the Black community, there is still a deep sense that had it not been for videos, the voices of these victims, the stories of these victims would not have been heard. So I am less complimentary of our progress and more hopeful that we will see that there is some deep systemic issues. And I think when we talk about systemic racism, one of the things we have to distinguish here is, in the proper definition of it, is systemic racism is not the assumption that there is an evil intent between you and I, but it is the recognition that there are systems in place that are bigger than you and I, that create culture for institutions, that are a reflection of the fallen nature of man, that when codified creates bias even when you don't have evil intent towards me. And I think that what happened with George Floyd and these officers are a reflection of systems that have been set up that have to be deconstructed. And until we get to that place, I don't know if we're building towards the proper end. As Andy said, short-term grief and solidarity are wonderful in the moment, but they don't produce lasting change. There has to be an examination of what are the cultural conditions that make an Ahmaud Arbery, a Breonna Taylor, a George Floyd possible, and how do we deconstruct those and build something that is more reflective of what is true, just, and beautiful.
Questions are just flying in, and thanks everyone. Keep them coming. We'll get to as many as we can. You can type them into the chat or the Q&A or there on Facebook. Chris, I want to come back to you just quickly. Jack just wrote in a question in regards to what you said about police officers being the only ones who have the ability to take your freedom without judicial power. And his question is, and I want to just give you a chance to clarify. I think you did, but saying, well, you know, that's part of their role. That's what they've been tasked as part of protecting and serving. I don't think you were saying that they shouldn't have that power. Somebody's got to have that power.
No. What I'm saying is that power is a sacred trust. We give them that power, rightfully so. Listen, I praise God for that power when used correctly. But what we should expect is that with great power comes great accountability. And so when that power is misused and abused, we should not be surprised when there's an outcry. Listen, so often I hear people say, well, aren't you equally outraged with the Black on Black crime that happens in Black communities? And there's so much to be said about the misunderstanding and representation of that. But I will say is that there's a difference between my neighbor assaulting me and being convicted for that, as opposed to those who have been given the sacred trust to serve and protect their community using that power in unjust ways. Both are wrong, but because of the power that's been entrusted to law enforcement, they have a different level of accountability because of that sacred trust. That's my point there. Not that they shouldn't have it, but there's a greater standard of accountability because they do.
That's good.
Okay. Andy, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's the really essential point, that this is absolutely necessary. And when it breaks down, it damages all of us. When the police can't be trusted or are not trustworthy with the use of force that they're supposed to hold legitimately, it doesn't actually even just affect the communities which that misuse or abuse is targeted. As we've seen, it creates the context in which people justify other kinds of acts of disorder because they don't feel like they can trust the legitimate guardians. So everyone has a stake in this being upheld in a sacred way, like Chris said.
Yeah. And Don asked the question, is it possible to have justice apart from Jesus Christ? What is the basis for justice? It's a great question. And I wanted to throw it to you because that has to do with fermentation and carbonation. And by the way, if you don't know what we're talking about when we're talking about fermentation and carbonation, it was a framework that Andy gave in his talk between kind of expecting immediate infusion and long-term, systemic change. But it also goes to kind of a theological point that you've wrestled with in various books, Andy, which is, what is that already not yet? And then also we have examples of those who reduce the gospel just down to social justice sort of concerns. And, as if there's no repentance, as if there's no, becoming new in Christ, as if there's no sense of personal guilt. So can you help us think through those categories?
You just added a lot more to that question, brother.
Yeah, in 30 seconds or less.
Well, no, in the long run, what guarantees that justice will be done is that God has made himself known in Jesus Christ. God has made himself known as one who comes among us, in a sense, sanctifies the human condition. We see him as the true image of the invisible God that shows us that human beings can be like God, are meant to be reconciled to God. There's so much more I could say about that. And it's the return of Jesus before which every knee will bow, every perpetrator of injustice will be unmasked, whether there was a video or not. It's not forgotten by God. The horizon of Jesus' return is another key element of justice here and now, because if there's impunity in the world, and it often seems like there is impunity, then people will justify all kinds of things. But if there's a judgment, then even those who seem to get away with it will not. But also historically, I would say that the extension of recognition of image bearing to more and more people, first to, you could do it almost in any order, but to different ethnic groups, for example, among the first Christians, to people in different categories, the people who were free in Roman society and the people who were slaves in Roman society, treating one another as brother and sister rather than in terms of their social status, men and women, of course, ultimately children. Today in the week, Pascal Emmanuel Gobry has this interesting column about the invention of children. Children were thought of as non-persons. They were expendable. They could be used with great violence, actually. But the Christian tradition started to see them as image bearers. And why did this happen in the history of the world? It has really only happened in the way it happened as the gospel worked itself like leaven into the world of the late Roman Empire and what was left after the Roman Empire disintegrated. And that has taken a secular form to some extent. But we have a lot of evidence that it runs out of steam when it is secularized. That is, our society now has a very hard time recognizing the profoundly disabled, or those who we believe will be disabled while they're still in the womb, as deserving of protection and of all of our efforts to welcome them. We have a very hard time believing that the elderly, under certain conditions, really deserve to be cared for. I don't mean we as maybe the people watching this call, but our societies, nations like Belgium and the Netherlands that are way further along on secularization. So this idea that every human being matters because they're made in the image of God, to pick up on Chris's language, this is an idea that human beings are sacred. Why do we believe that? Because of the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. And while other countries implement certain degrees of justice, procedural justice for certain people, if you're a Han Chinese, the Chinese government, if you're obedient to the state, will take pretty good care of you. But if you're a Uyghur under the jurisdiction of China, you will be treated to cultural genocide. So without Jesus in history and the people of Jesus in history absorbing the implications of the gospel and repenting of our own tribalism and our own temptation to shrink the circle of protection and recognition, I don't think you really get the justice that all of our neighbors long for, whether they share our faith or not. Sorry, Chris, that wasn't 30 seconds. I'll try to be shorter.
That was good.
Complex questions.
Chris, I want to combine a handful of questions, and I'm going to just go ahead and say it's kind of in the whataboutism category that comes up at times like these. But I think there are questions that people want to know. For example, after Planned Parenthood tweeted out this week, their support for Black Lives Matter, a lot of us wanted to go, I think Ed Stetzer wrote, you should probably sit this one out since, there's such a disproportionate number of Black babies that are aborted. There's also, the question of the crime within African-American neighborhoods, or predominantly African-American neighborhoods, what's called black on black crime, as well as the breakdown of the family in, those neighborhoods and minority communities. And what we're seeing is socioeconomically, that's actually a misnomer. We could talk about poor white neighborhoods being in crisis as well in different ways. Mm-hmm. I bring all that to say there's a sense in which we need to focus on this injustice with George Floyd and what it reveals about the power dynamics and so on, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But these questions come up.
Absolutely.
Help us think through those things.
Yeah. First off, I'm grateful that you asked. And I think that one of the greatest acts of friendship and kindness that you can show to individuals like myself is to ask those tough questions, because what it gives us opportunity to do is to debunk and dismantle false narratives. The first question of black on black crime. Listen, every study that's been done shows that this is a matter of proximity, not race. If you look at white on white crime, you will find that it's approximately 87% of white crimes are committed by white perpetrators against white victims. It's because we live in communities that are racially segregated often, and we end up getting perpetrated or violated by those who are closest to us. So this has very little to do with race. It has more to do with proximity as it pertains to the question of Planned Parenthood. Well, I agree with Ed Stetzer's text that we should cry aloud against abortion, and many African-American leaders do. As a matter of fact, it was true maybe up until recent times that blacks tended to be pretty conservative in this country, pretty supportive of the sanctity of life, traditional marriage, and some of those values. Some of those things have shifted, but we're very protective of our babies and our children. And as it pertains to the breakdown of the family, you have to look at, there's multiple factors in that, but let's not overlook the fact that the criminal justice system has created a school to prison pipeline in which many black fathers, because of what we considered over criminalization, over policing, have been ripped from homes and put in prisons where they can't be in their children's lives. And we have to be able to correct that. We have to create restorative places and not just punitive places. But I'll say this, that studies have shown, you look at Charles Blow, who's written a great article for the New York Times op-ed piece on the involvement of black fathers who are present in the lives of their children. And what you see is that they do profoundly well compared to their counterparts in other ethnic groups. And so I think there's a lot of false narratives, but I think the most important thing here is that whenever we use those types of narratives as a way to distract from an injustice that's taking place, we need to evaluate our heart and say, why are we working so hard to distract from the injustice that is clearly in front of us by bringing in these other detractors? And I think that is what is more concerning to me as you look at what's happened to George Floyd. Even today with Ahmaud Arbery in the hearings, what came out is that the last thing this man heard before he died was the man standing over him calling him the N-word.
Yeah.
And you think about how dehumanizing that must have been for this man as he died. And for someone to then say to me, well, what about Planned Parenthood? Well, to me, it seems awfully insincere that would be the moment to bring that concern if it is genuine in the first place. So I think there's false narratives, but the bigger issue is if we're working that hard to distract from an injustice in front of our face, what does that tell us about our hearts?
I just want to couch this, Chris, and you didn't ask me to do this, but I don't know of very many pastors who have been so verbally and in action as pro-life as you. So I just want everyone, as you answer that question, to know at your former church, you had a CareNet Pregnancy Care Center as part of the church. Like it was not even something you supported. It was something you ran. And your work in families and fathers and children and homeschooling, in other words, I just wanted to bring that up. There's a question that came in, Andy, and I'll punt it to you from Brian. And I've heard this from a couple different places, but I want to send it your way just because of maybe it's unrelated, but I'm going to relate it because I'm the moderator. You wrote an article today. I don't know if it was today or yesterday. It was earlier this week, I believe, about how we don't need as much news as we're getting, especially right now. Brian, and we were joking about this before we went live, you can actually be dumber by watching so much. And I'm guilty of that this week. It's just hard. Yeah. But the question is, why is there no outrage about people who film, and specifically it's this murder, instead of putting down the phone and trying to stop it? I would also say, the filming that we're seeing of the rest of the violence around this, it's our tendency to film this stuff instead of actually, at one level, the filming helps us know. Without the filming, as Chris said before, this might have been swept under the rug as well. So anyway, I'm relating all that. Have at it. Good luck.
Well, I look at the protests right now, and one of the kind of hilarious aspects is everyone wants to make sure that they catch themselves on their phone protesting so they can put it on Instagram. And if ever Jesus' words on the Sermon on the Mount were appropriate to do your good deed, not so that you're seen by others, but do it because it's the thing to do, that would be good. I would like to see a lot less selfies and filming of lots of things. I mean, I should say I have carefully informed myself of what happened to George Floyd. I myself have not watched the video because I believe that these videos are needed as evidence and need to be reviewed in professional contexts where people have the professional environment to deal with the trauma of watching someone be killed. I understand that many people have watched it. I'm not really intending to say anything except that for myself, I have not watched the video itself. I think I have a very clear understanding of what happened, and it causes me horror and outrage without having to watch it. I am incredibly glad someone filmed it. I thank God that someone filmed it. What would you do if you're part of a community that knows that the police will, with little provocation, use force against you if you try to intervene as they're arresting a suspect? I mean, the vulnerability of knowing that there are 3 cops there and they're on edge and that you can't predict what they'll do. I think it's very hard to imagine a more substantial intervention if you're a bystander, an unarmed bystander, than to make sure that what is happening before your eyes is preserved for the record. Same with Philando Castile's girlfriend, who filmed the aftermath of his shooting when he was obeying every instruction from the police officer completely. I thank God these things are filmed. Do we need less mediating of all these things in our world? Would it be a better world if we had that? In one sense, yes. But at moments of injustice, if the truth can only be captured that way, I thank God we have cameras.
John, if I could just add to that, thank God for the Clapham sect, and thank God for Hannah More, whose work to fight against slavery was to awaken the moral imagination of her countrymen and women. And they did this in ways that were profoundly alarming and jarring, taking slave supporters of slavery to slave ships so they could smell the stench. I've been in a slave castle in Ghana, West Africa, and man, that was traumatizing to see pictures of that. Those of us who are pro-life will tell you that the turning point began when we showed images of what happened. Now with the ultrasound, what happens in the womb is no longer a mystery. We know the horror that happens in the womb through abortion. You may not want to see it, but the pain of seeing it, I think, may just be what jars us into reality. So yes, these videos are vital. And I think that the false bifurcation of this thought is that somehow it's either or. I think when you see the video, you see both happening. The community trying their best to intervene, to reason with police officers while filming. And I think both have to happen.
Yeah, it does. And I guess, the hard part is that we've seen filming I'm thinking of the Pokemon Go phenomenon where people are staring at their phones outside of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., or filming things that they should intervene in. And I think, Andy, that's where your article comes in. And again, there's so much of this. I don't know what you guys feel, but there's so much of this that just is like, okay, we got to walk and chew gum. We got to do both. We just can't make this false choice. Chris, I want you to jump on this one. It's a really great question. Gosh, these questions are really so good. Talk about Black Lives Matter, the saying and the movement, and help us make sense of the difference.
Yeah, I'm grateful that you drew those distinctive lines. I think, let me start with the saying, and then I'll talk about the organization. The saying Black Lives Matter is the saying that if we are going to affirm the intrinsic value of all people, we have to start with the least of these in our society. If I can affirm that the least of these matter, then the hierarchy then from there would assume that every other life matters. Mm-hmm. And in society, ethnic minorities, the poor, the underprivileged, the marginalized often live in communities of color. And so the saying Black Lives Matter, which is something we should affirm, is meant to affirm that the least of these matter, which is a very deeply biblical, gospel-centered statement. And because the least of these matter, then all lives matter. Again, I would equate it to the unborn, that if we can affirm the personhood of the unborn, then all other lives matter. Our good friend Ravi Zacharias, who recently passed, said this, that all other human rights depend on the right to be human. If we can establish that, then we can establish every other human right. The organization, though, and this is where there is innate contradiction. You brought up Planned Parenthood earlier. The organization, since it has been by and large influenced by critical race theory and secular visions or ideologies concerning how to solve the problem, has, similar to Karl Marx, rightly diagnosed some of what ails us, but has not prescribed the right solution to fix it. The organization has brought into supporting organizations like Planned Parenthood, which is a direct contradiction to the preservation of Black life. And so because of that, I can't support the organization, though I would agree in some instances with the diagnosis of the problem, but it's the physician who diagnoses the problem correctly, but gives the wrong treatment. And as the church, we have to be able to say, yes, there is injustice. Yes, there is in certain institutions and arenas of life, systemic racism. And that's the right diagnosis of the problem. But there is a better solution that is found in the gospel, which is called Christian solidarity, demonstrating itself through friendship and hospitality, the act of love known as listening as we enter into one another's stories. This is the better way, the preservation of life. All lives should matter, but it starts with the least of these. And if we can affirm that, then we can affirm everyone else.
And so many of these questions are heading this direction, which is where I'm glad, and we could trust me, these conversations go on a lot longer. But I want to start with you because there's this question from Claire. So the spirit of all these questions are, so what can we do? Some people are, it's kind of that we've got to do something, and everyone's like, I'm in. What do I do? And then they feel like there's silence. And I oftentimes, feel like that. Richard, just what can we as white Christians begin to do to make a difference? So all of this, and I wanted to start with you because Claire's question in particular wasn't just she's white, what can I do? But some of us just live in racially homogenous places. We don't necessarily have diverse communities. If you're in Montana, that's just, you're in Montana, it's different. It's not New York City. So help us get to a point of something to do. What can we do?
Sure. I think specifically on the way that law enforcement operates, this is actually an unusual case where there's actually a great deal we can do because so much is local. So many issues that we wrestle with have really, especially in our modern era, rise to the level of the federal government, and the federal government really sets the agenda in many ways. And of course, the federal government has an important role to play in oversight of policing. But policing is still, the authority over policing is at the city, county level, in some respects, state level. And this actually means it's quite close to home for us. And so I think each of us needs to learn what's going on in our city because I live just outside Philadelphia. I live just down the street from a post-industrial small city called Chester. The story in Chester, the story in Philadelphia, the story in Camden, New Jersey. Each of these cities has its own story. And then my own county, which is a suburban county, has its own story. And it's actually not hard to find the entry points to just learn about what's going on. And there are local leaders who you can meet and learn from. And I would try to find out who's already engaging with the police, especially from the church. It would be rare that there would, if there are any churches that represent ethnic minorities of any kind near you, it would be rare not to have at least one pastor who's active in connecting with civic officials, law enforcement, because the non-white church has been very conscious of the need to be involved in this and has been empowered to be involved in it appropriately so. So I would find some of those folks, go to a few meetings, learn what's going on, start reading your local paper, reading other local news sources and information sources, because actually I think a lot of these things have to be solved at the local level. Just as a very concrete example, the Minneapolis Police Department, in its procedure manual, as I understand it from what I've read, in theory allows the kind of neck restraint as a possible intervention, which most police departments do not allow. And you're not going to solve that I guess we could try to create a national movement to end that. But really the issue is that in Minneapolis, there probably needs to be a change of many things, but that policy could be changed. So there's just so much local about this, which is actually great news for those of us who want to act locally. If you feel like, gosh, I live in a very homogenous community without a lot of these issues, I would challenge that. You might live in a state like Montana that doesn't have a lot of classic ethnic diversity. You cannot live in Montana and not know that there are very deep troubles at the interface between the reservations on which the native population was relocated and what happens when they come into town and how they're treated by police and by the white population when they're in town. There's nowhere in the United States that doesn't have communities that are neglected, that are treated as second best, whose lives are not treated as if they matter in the same way as others. And I think it's our job to find out who they are, what their story is, and what systems are serving or not serving them well.
Chris, I want to punt this to you, but I want to direct it a little bit. I'm going to give you kind of a final word on this in a few minutes. Man, that clock is ticking fast, isn't it? So a comment just came in from Facebook saying, thanks for trying to answer that question, because a lot of times it feels as a white person that, the answer is, flagellate yourself for being white, and that's not really helpful, the kind of the white guilt thing. You've been an outspoken critic of critical theory, which is often applied in the racial context. And because we're often an all or nothing sort of people, people are going to hear what you're saying. And I know it's not true and say, well, he's just parroting the critical race theory. I know, for example, that you've criticized the new Jim Crow thesis on mass incarceration, along with Anthony Bradley and others. So you're trying to bring some clarity and nuance to this. But could you at least directly speak to the idea of critical theory and why you don't think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so don't let me, that's not helpful either. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think to sum up critical theory in 30 seconds, it is the sense that the central worldview or the way that we see the world is through the lens of race. It goes on to then group people into categories. You have oppressed peoples and you have oppressors, and everyone fits into that category. And if you have found yourself living on the more pleasant side of life socioeconomically, then you either are an oppressor or you have supported the systems of oppression. It is not until you are oppressed that you really become the redeemed or the righteous. You carry this theory out a little bit further. Everyone in the oppressed group is then righteous, and those who are oppressors are all condemned by category, not by individual need for salvation or your own individual acts of righteousness. No matter what you do in the critical race theory, according to Derek Bell, who popularized it from Harvard, you are no more than your group. Well, we know that this type of collectivist thinking is not consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We all individually need to find ourselves bowing our knee at the cross. And so, no, you're not innately evil because you are white, and you're not innately righteous because you are black. But I think we have lost nuance in our conversations. We have created these broad stereotypes. All police officers are evil. Everyone who talks about injustice is an anarchist or social justice warrior. I think what we have to be able to do is to go back to having enough thoughtfulness and enough nuance to be able to say that we're dealing with individuals in each and every case, we're made in the image of God, and we need to be able to affirm what is true while at the same time denying what is not true. So, yeah, critical race theory, I think, is ultimately antithetical to the gospel. We have to be able to say that all men are in need of salvation and all men are able to be redeemed. Every sinner has a past, every saint has a past, every sinner has a future, and this is what we have to believe because this is what the gospel says. I would also say to my white brothers and sisters who are wondering what to do, I think we know the answer to this. Do everything you do for international missions locally. Like everything we do for global missions, just do it locally. Like we romanticize reaching peoples overseas while we seem to not know what to do about reaching people 20 miles away. You know, the same way we go and visit in these short-term mission trips, other nations, go visit another city. The same way we support indigenous leadership in other nations and support indigenous leadership in the inner city. So everything that we do in global missions, just apply it to that city 20 miles away or 20 minutes away and do everything the same.
You know, what's interesting about that is that missions has taken on, international missions has taken on such a structural, not just, you know, you go and share the gospel, but you go and, you know, create opportunity and try to restore rule of law and try to bring. So that's such a, I think you just answered 17 questions just with that answer. Chris, I want to give you another question which has come through, which is there's been a lot said and written, including by some African-American leaders that I know and respect, that how strange it is that in some of these, well, the question has to do with the agitation that's happening in these protests turning into violence. And this kind of strange reality that a lot of them look like white millennials, you know, that are, you know, doing a lot of the, do you want to speak to that at all? First of all, the rioting might take over this whole story, which would be a real shame if we don't actually confront what's happening. But what's your thought about this agitation, Antifa, any of that, you know, that you'd like to talk about?
Again, we need less news media, right? Because these sound bites become the dominant narrative. Let me just, for, again, thinking people, we have to have the maturity to distinguish between protest and riot, right? A part of a democracy, the advancement of a democratic republic like ours has depended on protests, right? From the Boston Tea Party to the Civil Rights Movement to now, we cannot, who are Protestants, decry against protesting. We are a people of protest, right? This is just the organizing publicly of people, groups of people, to let their voice be heard because they've exhausted other means. And when it's done peacefully, it is a protest, which the vast majority of the gatherings around our country have been that. What the news strives off of are those that are hijacked by nefarious forces that want to bring other agendas. We don't like the president. We want to unseat him. We want to advance some other cause or issue. And the next thing you know, it's not about injustice against Floyd. It's about some other agenda that wants to be advanced. And now destruction and all these things are happening. I think that the fact that we have more white young people involved, on the one hand, is heartening. It is very encouraging. Because if you are white, you need to understand that one of the greatest things you can do is to talk to other brothers and sisters who are white, because maybe you'll be heard when an ethnic minority may not be heard. Listen, I have a platform as a radio host where there is a group of people around the country, for some reason, odd reason, that trust me, that may not trust someone else. And so part of the way that I can leverage my social capital, my relational capital, is by speaking up on behalf of those who don't have a voice. That's Proverbs 31, 8 and 9. But we have to understand that there are also those who this is an adrenaline rush. This is a way of being rebellious, anarchist. And part of what I've resolved, John, is that I won't support any protest or rally that's organized by people out of the community, outside of the community, outside of the state. Because when these protests are organized by people who live there, listen, in Detroit, and I'll just use this example. In Detroit, one of the first nights of the protest, it was right down the street from my brother-in-law's house. He works there. He's a community developer there. He lives there. the last thing he wants to do is burn down his community. The last thing he wants to do is destroy businesses. By and large, a lot of them have been ethnic minority-owned businesses that have been hurt and harmed. But there are forces outside that just want to stir up division, confusion, and chaos. And we have to be able to know that. And what I have been proud of are the videos where we see protesters stopping those who want to try to loot, destroy, and damage in their community, to say that's not what we're here for. Justice for Floyd doesn't mean looting and vandalism. I also want to just real quickly, John, just give a moment to recognize the police officers who have died in service of their community during these hijacked protests. Retired police captain from St. Louis, David Dorn, volunteered to serve and lost his life. This is senseless injustice as well that we have to cry out against.
Andy, what are the best resources that you have found to help Christians think through both the issue of race as well, and that maybe have been most helpful in shaping your view, and then, but also social change, because that's a question that's coming through. And then I'm going to add to it and say 30 seconds or less. As a parent, what about talking to kids?
Well, in the end, I would say, at least as my children have gotten older, it's not actually a different answer. I think books are underrated. Everyone wants to read the news. Nobody wants to sit down and read a book. But if you read, I would start probably with W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk, an extraordinary and important work in American history, one of the great works of American sociology, a deeply Christian work, though his own faith might not, I don't know if he could be on Moody Radio, but he certainly spoke as someone shaped by the Christian tradition. It's an amazing book that will give you the historical background of essentially the failed promises of Reconstruction and the systems that they started to set up. I'd suggest books like The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. These protests have taken place in northern cities predominantly. I mean, they've been all over, but it's interesting how often these injustices are in places that actually were not part of the Jim Crow South, but that have their own actually more tangled history of suppression and oppression of Black communities in particular. And The Warmth of Other Suns is just an amazing journey through that.
Could you say that again? Sorry, The Worth of Other Suns?
Warmth
of Other Suns.
It's a phrase from a poem by Maya Angelou or something. I forget the original source. The Warmth of Other Suns. Really, if there were one book to understand why American cities have felt the way they have during my lifetime, it would be that book. Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, about the history of how law in the United States has really not been to protect and serve the citizens. It's been to protect and serve white interests very often. So I would say books, and teenagers can read these books. I mean, they're compelling books. They're memorable books. They're vivid books. And I would encourage anyone with children, certainly over 12, to read them together. Younger children, I no longer have. My children are now in college and just out. But maybe I'll punt on that myself, just because I don't know that I have a good, crisp answer for you, except to be praying for justice. And children instinctively understand that everyone's made in the image of God. Race consciousness doesn't actually enter, it seems, until 8 or 9 for most kids, unless they're in really difficult environments. And until then, they really it's so hard for them to imagine this. And so I think we need to shepherd them through, all parents need to be probably doing a better job of shepherding their children through the reality of race and the reality of violence and the hope for reconciliation that really answers what children instinctively, I think, almost always want.
Could you make sure to email us that list there, Andy, afterwards, because folks are asking for it, and we'll be sure to send that out with the email that follows this. And as this is the upside of social media, you are corrected that phrase, The Warmth of Other Suns. Richard Wright.
From Richard Wright.
Yeah, a poem called Black Boy in 1945. So you always love how good Google is to correct us. So that's good. It's great. Chris, I'm going to ask you this question, and we're going to push over just a little bit over the hour with it, but I think that's okay. I'm hearing this, and I think you need to address it. You're probably hearing it as well. The numbers having to do with unarmed Black men killed by police, less than 10 in 2019, whites were 19. That to me screams a ridiculous proportion, given the size of the population. However, that number, is being used to say that there's not an issue when it comes to, police and authority and that sort of stuff. One of the things, and I wanted you to address it beyond killing, has to do with how quickly arrests, between, police, and how often, how quickly they escalate. It's the escalation. Yeah. That's my impulse to say it's more than just whether somebody actually gets shot. That's where it's, that's awful. I mean, that's as bad as it can get. But being pulled over in your own neighborhood, in your own car, that sort of thing. Could you speak to some of that? Because that's an experience I know struck me years ago when you and I had this conversation around, I think, Ferguson on the radio, Chris. And you said, I had a conversation with my son, and I thought, I haven't had that conversation with my son.
Yeah, when people talk about the talk, typically you think with teenagers you're talking about the birds and the bees, but in the Black community, the talk is how to engage with law enforcement if you have an encounter with law enforcement in a way in which you can hopefully drive away with your life. I could be anecdotal here. I would defer to people like Senator Tim Scott, who stood before his colleagues and shared what it's like to be a Black man and a senator. And this is a conservative. So he's not propagating a liberal agenda or ideology. He's simply sharing lived experiences of what it was like to be pulled over so many times that he downgraded his automobile as to avoid being pulled over in his community because it looked as if he was driving too nice of an automobile. I think to compare the number just on a statistical level, I think, again, this is where we have to be sophisticated in our thinking on a statistical level to say X number of white people experience this, and it's a similar number to X number of Black people. When you factor in population size, those things become untenable. When you see that Blacks, only 13% of the population, and experience this in a disproportionate way, the overwhelming evidence for those who want to go beyond sound bites and want to do sincere research is that Blacks are pulled over twice as many times. We end up having inappropriate amounts of physical violence appropriated to us by those in authority at the rate of 4.5 times as much. Radley Balco has written a phenomenal article on this, listing about 25 different research studies for the Washington Post. Radley Balco, it's an overwhelming reality. Here's the problem with racial profiling in policing, is that so often it's produced, quote unquote, results from a pragmatic perspective. And police officers have confessed to that reality. And when you are racial profiling, you are pulling people over more often than not for minor issues that can easily, because of the theater of our minds, that police officer has a movie playing in his head about me, and I have a movie playing in my head about him, and that can easily explode because of misunderstandings. I'll give you one example of this, John, and I know we're over time, but a good friend of mine, Henry McClendon, runs police community summits where those who say that they have had excessive force perpetrated against them by the police here in Detroit can meet after the case has been resolved to talk through how each encountered that moment. And he tells of a story of a mom who says she trained her son from the time he was a boy that if you ever get pulled over by the police, you put your hand on 10 and 2, don't make eye contact, say very little, because it will be seen as an act of aggression so you can get out of there with your life. You know what the police officer said, John? If I pulled over your son, ma'am, and he didn't make eye contact with me and said very little, it would give me every signal as a law enforcement agent that something was wrong and that there was suspicion there that he had committed a crime. And so here are two dueling narratives that can explode easily in a moment that could end up taking someone's life because of preconditioned biases. And so, again, if we're working hard to discredit acts of abuse and injustice, also we can win an argument, then we have to evaluate our hearts. We can't turn away from the George Floyds, the Breonna Taylors, the Ahmaud Arbery's, the Tamir Rices, the Philando Castillos, the Eric Gardners. The list goes on and on and on. This isn't make-believe. This isn't brainwashing. These are real people real experiences. And as a Black man, I've encountered it way too much to be silent.
Well, gentlemen, we've covered a lot of ground, and I think we tackled some really difficult questions without sidestepping them, and still we weren't able to get to everything. There's a lot more to be said. And you guys have helped us think through this. Chris, tell folks where they can find you if they want to follow your work and follow your writing in this conversation as you have it.
Yeah, I've written a couple of articles on this, George Floyd, the Gospel and Our Response. You can find it at my Facebook, social media sites, Twitter, and Equip Radio. Equip Radio on Twitter, Equip Radio on Facebook, daily broadcasting across the country and into Canada there.
Andy, where can people find you?
Probably the easiest is Twitter, AHC, 3 letters, AHC.
And I repeat, if you're not on Twitter, don't start. But if you are,
I completely agree.
You completely agree. You can follow Andy. Just a couple announcements here. I want to thank our sponsor for this module, which is the Alliance Defending Freedom, organization that does great work when it comes to religious liberty. I also want to mention that the audio of this Q&A will be available on the Truth Love Together website. That's at conference.colsoncenter.org. And if you're joining us and you haven't been following the different modules, every single week, we release a module with about 2 hours of content, 4 different speakers. Module 1 was What is Truth? Module 2 is What is Love? This module, How do we become people of truth and love? Next Monday, Module 4 goes live, and that will be led by Lee Strobel, Pramod Haq, Obianuju Ekiocha, who is a champion of the pro-life movement on the continent of Africa, and Jay Warner Wallace. And this module is about telling the truth today in love, which is something I think both of you guys did with us today, and I'm grateful for it. Thanks for your sessions, Chris, Andy. Thanks for your friendship, and thanks for your leadership in this area.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast. As John mentioned, come to conference.colsoncenter.org to register for free, and you can watch the rest of Module 4 with an introduction by John Stonestreet, Lee Strobel on becoming stronger salt and brighter light, Pramod Haq on being a public witness in an unbelieving culture, and Obianuju Ekiocha on why telling the truth is an act of love. Again, that's conference.colsoncenter.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.